My intention with this little talk is to give you a framework to at least understand sort of the historical moments in the development of these different Buddhist schools. And I'm going to be doing several more sessions in this little mini series where I'll talk about, the basic beliefs and development of, say, the Theravada system, the Mahayana system, the Vajrayana system. Those are kind of like the three, major divisions of Buddhism that people usually think about. So just so you know, this time we're not going to talk a lot about, beliefs and what makes these different schools different. I'm more going to go over sort of the historical development and how and why, I guess, different schools ended up looking pretty different. I created a handout to go along with this presentation. If you'd like to grab that for free, please find the link now in the notes. I'm just really delighted to be with y'all though, because I think it's such an important topic. If you're new to Buddhism, there's so many different schools, there's so many different teachers, and I know I actually started just kind of like reading this and reading that, and it's difficult to know how to put everything together. So first of all, I just wanted to explain a few terms before we start talking about, the development of Buddhism. So first of all, who is the Buddha? So this term means like the awakened one. So Bud is like a Sanskrit root word. Buddha is one who has woken up. If you listen to my last talk on Insight Timer, it was about bodhicitta. Bodhi is related to Buddha. It also means awakening. So the Buddha, the historical Buddha, lived about 550 BCE, and this is the founder of the Buddhist tradition. And the Buddha's role really is that he woke up to reality and then he taught everyone else how to do it too. So what he taught is called the dharma. So Buddhists will talk about the dharma in the sense of like what you're practicing, the teachings of the Buddha, what you've realized in your own mind. So the dharma can mean all of those things. You could translate the word as like truth. You could also translate it a bit more maybe metaphorically as like the path that leads you to realize that truth for yourself. The next term I want to mention is the sangha. So this is the community of those who practice the Buddha's dharma together. And in some contexts, like especially in Theravada countries, and I'll talk in a minute about these major divisions, but Theravada countries tend to be, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, so sometimes it's called Southern Buddhism. In those schools, sometimes when people talk about the sangha, they're talking about the ordained sangha, the community of monks and nuns. So if you're not familiar with this, Buddhism has kind of two categories of practitioners. There's the ordained folks, the sangha, the ordained sangha, and then there's also the rest of us who are lay people and we're practicing, but we're not ordained. So sometimes people think like, oh, the really serious Buddhists are out there as like monks and nuns, but actually all the rest of us can practice too, can become enlightened. There are stories from the earliest times of Buddhism of lay people becoming enlightened, so it's not just a business for monks and nuns. Just want to say that. And then the next term I want to talk about is Theravada. So I've already said this a couple of times. The Theravada tradition is, there used to be something like 26 different sects of early Buddhism, and the Theravada school is the only one that remains of that. So it's kind of the oldest living lineage of Buddhism that still maintains an emphasis on the original texts that were like recorded, probably taught, during the Buddha's lifetime and then written down a few hundred years later. So the Theravada literally means the way of the elders, and what it's saying is that this is the tradition that preserves the oldest layer of teachings in Buddhism. The next term I want to explain is Mahayana, and this is a form of Buddhism that developed about 500 years after the time of the Buddha. People had been, digesting and wrestling with some of the big issues and topics in Buddhism, and about 500 years after the lifetime of the Buddha, this kind of formed into a new development in Buddhism. Scholarship right now is kind of evolving as to what exactly happened at the beginning of the Mahayana era in Buddhism. So I don't want to go into that stuff, but basically that's when it arose, and it's now more predominant in East Asia. The Vajrayana schools, which we're going to talk about next, are also within sort of the Mahayana umbrella, so to speak. So these are the schools of Buddhism, not just in East Asia, but some Southeast Asian countries have Mahayana as well. The Himalayan region of, Tibet, Bhutan, Nepal, Mongolia. I guess Mongolia is not really Himalayan, but it's still, an area where they practice Vajrayana Buddhism. All of those schools are considered part of Mahayana. Mahayana means the great vehicle, and the idea, behind that name that these folks gave to themselves was they're trying to make a big inclusive system. Lay people can become enlightened. There's more Buddhas. Like in the Theravada system, they tend to think of just the one Buddha, the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni. But the Mahayanists think there are countless numbers of Buddhas. There's a really important doctrine called Buddha nature that says that every single one of us has the capacity to wake up and become a Buddha. So that's Mahayana Buddhism. Vajrayana Buddhism developed another approximately 500 years later, or began to develop. And Vajrayana Buddhism, so I practice in Tibetan Buddhism. That is kind of what everybody thinks of when they think of Vajrayana Buddhism. It can also be called Tantric Buddhism. And like I mentioned a moment ago, that form of Buddhism is dominant in the Himalayan regions, so Tibet, Bhutan, regions of Nepal, some regions of India. It's also found in Mongolia, but there's also a Vajrayana strand that goes along with most forms of Mahayana Buddhism. So like in East Asia, people will say mantras and they'll use mandalas. Mantras are sacred syllables like Om Mani Padme Hung that kind of evoke the energy of a Buddha, of a deity, you might say, like that divine energy of compassion, for instance, is what goes along with Om Mani Padme Hung. People also use what are called mandalas, so like representations of the sacred world of a Buddha. So that can be found in most Mahayana schools, but it really only became the dominant form of practice and teaching in these countries, these regions, mostly in the Himalayas. So that's a very brief tour of some important names and the important developments in Buddhism that we're going to talk about. If you have questions, feel free to drop them in the comments here, and I will do my best to answer them. If you're watching later on YouTube, just drop a comment in, and as soon as I can, I'll get back to you. So these are kind of like the three major forms of Buddhism as it exists right now: the Theravada, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana. And I want to just go through a few important dates in Buddhist history to give you a sense of the timeline and the kind of spread of these ideas and how we got into this situation where Buddhism is all over Asia and it can look very different from one place to another, but a lot of the core ideas are the same. The first date I want to talk about is approximately 563 BCE. And that is when Prince Siddhartha was born, and he was born in what's now Lumbini, Nepal. And this was a time when Hinduism was undergoing what we call Hinduism now. I mean, the religions of India. So there was a shift going on from the more ritualistic Vedas, and people were beginning to compose and to do practices around what are called the Upanishads, which are more like philosophical, contemplative texts. This is where a lot of, what's written about yoga has its roots. So very profound, things that people were thinking about and reflecting on at this time. So it's said that the Buddha lived until about the age of 80 and had a very long teaching life. So about 40 years of teaching. And so that brings us almost to, the end of the I guess, the 6th century BCE. Well, I guess a little past the end of the 6th century BCE, if he lived until about 80. So Buddhism in the lifetime of the Buddha it spread relatively quickly. Like, this was a time when a lot of people were interested in spiritual ideas. It's also a time when the Jain tradition of ancient India that survives also to today began. So about 150 to 200 years after the death of the Buddha, there's another big development in the spread of Buddhism. And this is the rule of Emperor Ashoka of the Mauryan dynasty in India. I probably just said that wrong. But a great ruler. He's actually still memorialized on some of the coins and the currency of India today. And he basically conquered everybody, did a lot of killing, and then converted to Buddhism. And his rule after that conversion is said to be kind of like a high point, one of the high points of like Indian imperial rule. And one of the things he did, like the reason he's important to our story, is that Ashoka sent out missionaries. And basically, it was during this time that Buddhism spread throughout most of what's now India. So Buddhism developed in northern India, and then King Ashoka sent missionaries down to the south and throughout the north into what's now Sri Lanka. And I believe it's actually said that one of, or possibly a son and daughter of King Ashoka went down to Sri Lanka and helped to establish the Buddhist monastic order down there. So he's a very important figure in, Buddhist history, but also sort of Buddhist mythology. This idea that you can have an enlightened emperor who can help to spread the dharma. He also did things like providing hostels for travelers to stay on, and improving highways, stuff like that made people's lives easier. So he's seen as a great benefactor of the people. So that's the beginning of Buddhism's kind of spread outside of that northern Indian area where it first developed. So then that brings us to about the 1st century CE, and this is when the Mahayana begins to develop. So there's already been, about 5 centuries of people thinking about Buddhist doctrines and sort of having the time to kind of work out all the logical implications of the doctrines. And I want to talk about this much more in the next couple of sessions. If you're familiar with the Four Noble Truths, you know that basically all Buddhist schools believe in those. And what those say is, like, first of all, as long as we're not enlightened, there's suffering, there's dukkha. There's at least unsatisfactoriness involved in life. The second one is that the cause of that unsatisfactoriness is that we don't actually understand the world properly. Like, we think of ourselves as being permanent, everyone else around us as being maybe not permanent, but like we don't think of ourselves as these like impermanent, constantly changing, constantly evolving beings. So we grab onto stuff. We try and make things exactly the way we want them. And that causes us to suffer because we can't make things exactly the way we want them. And then the third noble truth is that there's an end to that suffering. That if we stop creating the causes, if we stop grabbing onto stuff or trying to keep away things that we don't want, sooner or later we run out of the causes of suffering and we kind of emerge into bliss. And then the fourth noble truth is that there's a path from where we are now to this awakened life, completely beyond suffering, completely blissful, and that's the Noble Eightfold Path. So I just want to say, all Buddhist schools agree with that assessment. All Buddhist schools agree that we're impermanent, that, you know, if we try and make everything work out the way we want it to, life is going to be unsatisfactory. They all agree that there is no inherent, unchanging sense of self, that we're just constantly in a state of change. And when we try to get exactly what we want, we're trying to please a self that doesn't really exist. And that's part of the reason that there's suffering. So, you know, the Mahayana schools sort of took those ideas a step further, and they said, they really got into the ideas of Buddha nature and emptiness and other stuff too, but like, you could go on. There's a whole lot involved. I don't want to make it too in depth, but basically, you could say like the third noble truth, that there's an end to suffering. What it really means is that it's not our true nature to suffer. So the Mahayanists kind of developed that idea into what they call Buddha nature, which is that our true nature is already awakened, it's already liberated, and the whole point of practice is just to kind of uncover that. They also talk about this idea of emptiness, which is that not only is there no inherently existent self, like everything we think of that makes up our sense of self, like our body, our mind, like all of that stuff isn't inherently existent either. So they kind of take this deconstruction of the person and they take it even further, and they just say, it's almost like reading quantum physics, They say like, okay, you can divide everything down to atoms, but when you get down to the atoms, you pull the atoms apart into subatomic particles, and those don't inherently exist either. So the Mahayana schools are just further developing the ideas that were already there in the original teachings of the Buddha, in what's now the Theravada schools. So, 500 years of that kind of development of people doing different types of practices, and we have the beginnings of the Mahayana school. In about the 3rd century CE, Buddhism spreads to China. And so Buddhism had already spread to Sri Lanka. It's kind of gradually spreading out through Asia over these centuries. And the spread to China is really significant. It takes several hundred years for Buddhism to really become part of Chinese culture. So, the 3rd century CE, it's not like Buddhism suddenly just like exploded in China, but by, the 5th century CE and a couple of centuries after that, there's this real integration between Taoism in China and some Confucianism as well, and Buddhism. And that becomes a form that spreads to Japan and Korea and through a lot of East Asia. So that's part of the reason, that that East Asian Buddhism looks the way it does, is, it's spreading at a time when there's both Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism. They're in contact with India, so as the Vajrayana schools began to develop 500 years after the Mahayana, the Chinese were receiving some of those traditions as well. And, both Japan and Korea, what's now Japan and Korea, kind of look to China as their, the place where they got their form of dharma. It's a little more complicated. I mean, there's, a lot of cross-pollination among all those countries over there. But basically, when Buddhism goes to China, it begins this sort of new transformation. Buddhism also spreads to Southeast Asia. So in places like Indonesia, and I believe Buddhism arrived a little bit later there. So Indonesia got a very like Vajrayana flavored form of Buddhism. And there they also had Hinduism. So you have like a whole new mix in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia. So basically everywhere that Buddhism is spreading, it interacts with the culture there. And you just end up having all these very rich and increasingly diverse forms of Buddhism. In about the 5th century CE, you have the beginnings of Buddhist tantra. And scholars are still really trying to figure out exactly the origins of Buddhist tantra, but it's clear that there was a dialogue going on, especially in those early days, between Buddhist and Hindu tantric forms. So people were developing practices. They probably were, communicating with each other, maybe learning from each other and practicing with each other. And in this new form of Buddhism, this, Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism, the reason it's called Vajrayana, which can be translated as either like the diamond vehicle, because it's like the thing that cuts through everything. It can also be translated as the thunderbolt vehicle, because it's very fast, it's like immediate. And the thing that's distinctive about the Vajrayana, and again, we'll go into this in a lot more detail in a couple of weeks, but the thing that's distinctive about the Vajrayana is that it's called a fruitional practice. So instead of, just sort of sitting down, doing practices to bring your mind back, cultivating merit through practices like generosity, feeding people and stuff like that, you're actually trying to get in touch directly with your Buddha nature. So there's one type of practice called deity yoga, where you're actually imagining a Buddha, and then you imagine, that Buddha melts into you. You become that Buddha. So you're trying to experience directly your Buddha nature. And if you say the mantra, again, to go back to my earlier example, the mantra Om Mani Padme Hung, it's the mantra of the Buddha of compassion. And as you say it, it's like according to one way of practicing, you're sending out beams of light in all directions. Like the mantra is going around your heart center. You're a Buddha. You're sending beams of light in all directions. You're purifying everyone's, suffering and hardship. You're helping everyone to wake up. So it's really a practice in which you're directly getting in touch with that stuff. So again, the basic ideas of compassion, emptiness, trying to help everyone wake up out of suffering, recognizing our own suffering, recognizing it doesn't have to be that way. All those things are the same, but in a different way. So that's the Vajrayana approach to Buddhism. So 5th century CE, the Vajrayana tradition begins to develop in India. So in the 6th century CE, Muslim invasions of India begin. So this is what's going to become the Mughal dynasty later in India. But the impact that it has on Buddhism in India is that Buddhism was becoming increasingly monastic. There were these very large universities and monasteries and things, and it really required a ruler's support to kind of fund these big Buddhist institutions. So as, rulers kind of got toppled by this new wave of invaders, Buddhists often would see their monastery destroyed, and if there weren't the resources to rebuild it, that was just kind of it. So basically, over these, from about maybe 600 AD to maybe 1200 AD, there are just waves of kind of Muslim invaders into India. Also, I mentioned Buddhist Tantra and Hindu Tantra were very related. And part of what happened to kind of lead to the downfall of Buddhism in India was that a lot of Buddhist ideas were very similar to Hindu ones. And the Hindus kind of ended up saying, well, Buddha is one of the incarnations, I think, of Vishnu. And they kind of assimilated a lot of Buddhist ideas into what we would call non-Buddhist traditions. So between that and these invasions and, just the monastics and these big institutions have become a bit more disconnected from the lay people. And I mean, that's one of the traditional accounts that you read. Again, there's a lot of research going on. I'm not sure exactly where the current scholarly consensus would be, but basically over those centuries, Buddhism in India kind of weakened until finally in, I think, the 13th century, around the 13th century AD, Buddhism was really kind of finally wiped out. The Mughal invasions, they had taken a big toll on Buddhism, and Buddhism just kind of finally collapsed in on itself and basically went extinct in India. Sri Lanka still had its Buddhist tradition, and it had spread basically everywhere else in Asia, but in the homeland of Buddhism, it fell apart. Also, I should say, Nepal had a strong Buddhist tradition the whole time, and that is the birthplace of the Buddha. So, it didn't collapse everywhere in the land of its birth. So to quickly cover the rest of Buddhist history in just a couple minutes, in about the 7th to 8th century CE, Buddhism begins to spread into Tibet. So Tibet is inheriting this tantric Buddhism, and they got their dharma originally from Central Asia, from China, but they really turned to India as the source for their Buddhist teachings. And over those next centuries, until really the collapse of Buddhism in India, Tibetan scholars would go across the mountains into India. They would invite Indian scholars and practitioners and yogis. So there's a lot of cultural contact between those two places. Yeah, so then around the 12th century CE, Buddhism becomes extinct in India. And then we fast forward a bit here. to the 19th century CE, when, imperial nations in Europe started conquering places in Asia. I mean, they had started conquering places in Asia earlier, but it kind of took them a while to begin to translate texts, to learn Sanskrit and classical Chinese and all this stuff, and to kind of realize what they were in contact with, this great cultural system of Buddhism. So you get this real impact of Buddhist teachings on Western cultures beginning maybe at the earliest at the 18th century, definitely by the 19th century, and then definitely when you see like the mid 20th century, like the beats in the US, and there's just a lot of interest in, Zen and stuff like that. And then in 1959, Tibet kind of completely fell. Tibet was invaded by the Chinese when the communists took over in 1950, 1959. The Dalai Lama fled. A lot of Tibetans fled with him. So like in that mid 20th century, you got Tibetans coming out for the first time. So people are being exposed to Tibetan Buddhism, big cultural impact. And also, the experience of colonialism in Asia, where these Europeans were coming in and saying, oh, that's a bunch of, rubbish. Like it really impacted, the way that people in like Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia, places like that, were thinking about their own traditions. And there's this term Buddhist modernism. So people began to emphasize meditation more, and maybe things like reincarnation or the more like spiritual or religious aspect of the Buddhist tradition. They began to decrease the emphasis on that in some places. And that's definitely what happened in the West as Buddhism was transmitted over here, that to try and make it more compatible with Western culture, people didn't talk about stuff like reincarnation, karma, miraculous powers of Buddhas and stuff like that. A lot of that stuff has been kind of stripped out. And instead, what you see just like having a huge cultural impact right now is mindfulness. And like I kind of mentioned earlier, these supposedly non-Buddhist systems that are totally based on Buddhist traditions, like mindfulness, for instance. A lot of folks try to really distance, mindfulness from Buddhism. And it does leave out a lot of important stuff from the Buddhist tradition, but that's also 100% where it's coming from. So Sil says, did Buddhism really disappear from India? That makes me sad. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the things that were there in Buddhism just were kind of absorbed into different strands of Hindu culture. And also, Buddhism was going strong in Nepal and Sri Lanka, like in these countries kind of right around India, the land of Buddhism's birth. In Afghanistan, I mean, you probably heard about the giant reclining Buddha statues that were blown up by the Taliban. So it was all around. And what's interesting now is that like with Tibetan refugees and also with Indian independence and people in like untouchable castes looking for religious alternatives to Hinduism, there have been a lot of people who have converted, to Buddhism from Hinduism or even from Islam. So it's kind of like making a comeback in India at the moment, which is really cool. It's a very, very tiny minority religion in India still, but it's a real moment of spread, global spread for Buddhism. I mean, there are Buddhists in Africa and South America and North America and Europe, like everywhere on the planet now there's Buddhists. So it's a very exciting time. And again, a lot of cultural contact, just different cultures and the Dharma, like this really ancient tradition. So Natalie says, yay, the global spread makes me so happy. Me too. Yeah, a lot of people get a little bit like uncomfortable thinking about the changes that Buddhism is going through right now, but I think it has so much to offer us as like modern humans. Not just mindfulness, but like really a way of appreciating our interconnectedness and respecting others, cultivating compassion, like so many things that we need right now to face our collective challenges. So I'm very personally excited also that there's this spread and there's this kind of new thought going on as Buddhism spreads to different cultures. Okay, so that was a very brief tour through Buddhist history. I'll be doing next week, well, probably for the next 3 weeks, I'll be doing like other installments in this little mini series. I hope that this has been helpful to help you understand, some of the diversity of Buddhism, and we'll dive a lot more into the different beliefs and practices of these different major schools next time.